Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was one of those pale London mornings when the city seems reluctant to find its colour, and even the hansoms clatter with a muffled reserve. The fog had lifted, but would not quit the streets. It hung in webs about lampposts and crept thread-like along the eaves. I had breakfasted with Holmes at Baker Street and was debating the comparative merits of trout-fly patterns, when he, who had been stretched at length upon the settee with his violin across his knees, gave a little grunt of amusement and pointed the bow toward the door. "Your patient is late, Watson," said he. "The gentleman for whom you will presently relinquish that admirable chair took a wrong turning at Marylebone Lane, owing to a costermonger's overturned barrow. He will smell of bruised apples. You are in spirits this morning," said I, smiling despite myself. "But I confess I expect no patient." "No, but you expect a bill," he returned, and indicated with the tip of the bow a small smear upon my left cuff. "The blue chalk of a chemist's tally, picked up when you paid for tincture yesterday. Your landlady has a headache. She sent you after laudanum, intending it for tonight if necessary, but the label was altered at your request to 5 drops every 4 hours, which is the practice of a man who prefers sleep to caution. It does not matter, for the druggist knows you and watered the laudanum." I had no time to protest his liberties upon my conscience, for the bell pealed in the hall, and, after a word with Mrs. Hudson, the door opened upon Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, brisk in a dark ulster, and behind him a lady in travel-worn mourning whose hands, ungloved despite the cold, were clenched upon a little reticule as if it contained not a purse but a heart. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with a nod that was half salute and half surrender, "I would not disturb you so early if it were not a nasty business. Mrs. Ainsworth of Fern Lodge." On the heath the lady stepped forward. "Beatrice Ainsworth," she said, in a voice that had compelled itself to be calm for several hours, and was now failing in the effort. "My husband is dead, Mr. Holmes. He was found this morning in his private workroom. The door was locked on the inside. The window, oh merciful heavens, the window." Holmes had risen and placed the violin aside with the tenderness he rarely expended upon living things. "Pray sit, madam," he said in that gentle tone which never ceased to astonish me when it emerged from him as naturally as his sharper notes. "You have come in your carriage from Hampstead, and not the train. I observe the mud of the bridle road upon your hem, and the straw seed caught in it suggests the mews of a private stable. Tea, Watson, and Inspector. If you are here, it is because the yard is puzzled. You will spare me your synopsis, and Mrs. Ainsworth shall tell it. The window, what of it?" "It was the nursery window," she whispered, pressing the reticule so hard the metal clasp bit into her gloveless fingers. "It looks upon the east garden, and at dawn the housemaid drew back the blind to air the room." She screamed. There was a face at the glass. "A face," I repeated, involuntarily glancing toward our own fog-dim panes. "A face at the outside of the glass," said Lestrade, taking up the tale with a dry professional impatience that could not disguise his agitation. "At the 3rd story. She swears to it. What is more, there are the smears where breath, or something like breath, clouded the pane, and the mark where a human hand, or something like a hand, pressed upon it. But below is nothing. No ladder, no footprints in the frost-silvered mould, no ivy stout enough to bear a cat, and dash me, the window is latched within." Holmes's eyes had kindled with that inward fire to which his bloodless face served as lamp. "You interest me," he murmured. "And Mr. Ainsworth?" Mrs. Ainsworth's lips trembled. "Percival. He was a civil engineer, Mr. Holmes, with contracts upon the new railway cuttings. He kept a small room adjoining the nursery for his drawings and instruments. He worked there late last night." She swallowed. "He did not come to bed. Found how. In his chair, his head bent upon the table. The door was locked. The key was in the lock upon the inside. The window latched. The chimney too narrow. There was a smell strong of spirits. His hand was clenched upon his pen. There was, her composure cracked at last. There was a look upon his face that I can never forget." Lestrade interposed, perhaps to spare her. "Doctor says apoplexy. I say not. There is a discoloration, a streak at the corner of the mouth and a queer tightening of the jaw on the left that puts me in mind of, well, of something else. Of strychnine? I ventured. Not unless strychnine has taken to leaving a sweetish scent, said Lestrade. There was a scent in the room, and not spirit alone. The maid says carbolic. The gardener says tar. I say I don't know. But I know this. A groom on his way to the stables at daybreak swears he saw a pale face upon the nursery window for a moment, against the growing light, a face that looked down upon him with eyes as blank as a doll, then vanished. Holmes steepled his fingers and regarded the ceiling as if the plaster itself were a chessboard. Mrs. Ainsworth, he said, your husband had enemies. Do not spare me. We all have enemies, Mr. Holmes, though we never think so, she answered, the words weary rather than bitter. He dismissed our gardener, Thomas Pike, a fortnight ago for drunkenness and insolence. There is Mr. Julian Crowther, his partner once in a small surveying firm, who brought a suit in Chancery and lost it. She hesitated. There is my cousin, Mr. Lionel Hartley, who has been our guest these 3 weeks. He and Percival, oh, it is monstrous to speak of it, had words yesterday morning about a matter I must not discuss. Holmes's gaze, which had been distant, came back to her with a sudden clarity. Must not. Or dare not? He inquired, and then, seeing the tears rise, softened. Forgive me. We shall not force a locked drawer while the key may yet be found in a more honourable place. Mrs. Ainsworth has given us leave, said Lestrade, and I have a cab at the door. If you will come, Mr. Holmes. Holmes took up his ulster, and with that economy of motion that made him look, when active, like some instrument extended by the mind rather than the body, he began to don it. As he did so, his eye fell, hawk-like, upon a small stain on the strap of Mrs. Ainsworth's reticule. May I? He asked. And at her nod he touched it with the tip of a long finger, then raised the finger to his nostrils. Iodoform, he said, half to himself, and on the leather near it, a dusting of blue. Not the blue of a lady's powder, more the stain of a draftsman's chalk. You have handled your husband's instruments this morning, madam. I fetched his case-book for Inspector Lestrade, she said. Just so. Watson, your hat. The air upon the heath will be the better for your lungs and my logic. Within 10 minutes, we were rumbling through the waking city, past milk carts and yawning apprentices, past gentlemen with their collars hoisted to their ears, and errand boys blowing steam upon their fingers. Holmes sat forward, his sharp profile cut against the glass like a cameo. Without looking at me, he said, You observed that the inspector spoke of a sweetish scent. Do you recall, Watson, the case of the retired tanner in Bermondsey and the varnisher's apprentice? Ether, I said. And then patience, he murmured. We have so far a dead engineer in a locked room, a face at a third-story window, inexplicable breath-marks upon glass, frost without footprints, and a household whose relations are politely veiled. We are offered the common coinage of superstition, and I am to give the shopman's glance to see whether it is counterfeit. There is also the nursery, always a curious quarter of any house, where love and terror keep company under painted paper. At Hampstead, the sky had passed from pearl to a weak gold, as if someone had breathed upon the horizon and warmed it by a degree. Fern Lodge stood a little off the road, a clean modern house with a base of grey stone and upper stories of pale brick, its windows narrow and tall. It would have looked cheerful on a June afternoon. That morning it held itself like a lady at a funeral, upright, composed, but with something struggling in the throat. We were admitted by a parlour-maid whose eyes were red and whose apron was awry, and shown to a drawing-room where a fire had been encouraged beyond its natural temper. Mrs. Ainsworth's cousin was there, Mr. Lionel Hartley, an elegant, nervous young man with the sort of attractiveness one expects to see in Italian portraits, too smooth by half for the English climate. He started when we entered and then bowed. Mr. Holmes, said he with a practised ease that did not quite hide the tremor at his lip, this is a dreadful morning. Poor Beatrice, she is with the housekeeper. If I can be of service, later, said Holmes almost amiably. We shall begin at the nursery. Lestrade led the way up a staircase that turned upon itself twice and then opened upon a broad landing. The nursery door stood open. Beyond it a room lay in a chilly order, the fire unlit, the toys, few and old, arranged upon a shelf, and a painted rocking horse regarding us with an idiot's solemnity. The eastern window looked upon the garden, where frost lay in a glittering veil upon the cabbages and the stiff grass. Holmes went straight to the window and stood against the light. There, upon the inner surface of the glass, was indeed the faintest ghost of a shape, an oval blurred as though some cold face had pressed itself to the pane. Two dimmer circles, which might have been the hollows of eyes, marked its upper portion, and to the side a smear that could have been the drag of a hand. Holmes bent close, so close that for a heartbeat his own ascetic visage appeared to merge with that pale suggestion, and then, with a swift delicacy, he drew from his pocket lining a lens and examined the lower corner. "Watson," he said, "your hand." I offered it, and he guided my finger to a tiny crust at the very edge of the sash, a bead so small that I should never have noticed it. I touched it and brought it away between finger and thumb. It broke, leaving a faint tackiness and a minute scent, not quite sweet, not quite chemical, something that put me in mind of hospitals and the floor of a painter's shop. "What do you make of that?" said Lestrade, craning. "I make of it," said Holmes, still abstracted, "that we are to be very careful where we put our hands." He turned his attention to the sill, running a fingernail along a groove. Clean, too clean. And yet what is cleanliness but the memory of dirt?" He crossed to the adjoining door, which stood shut, and examined the keyhole. A speck of blue powder rested upon the rim like a star fallen into a thimble. He smiled, and the smile had nothing gentle in it. "Inspector," he said, "you shall first show me Mr. Ainsworth." Lestrade ushered us into the small workroom, communicating with the nursery, unlocked from within by the unhappy expedient of a table knife at the hinge, as I gathered from his scowl. Mr. Percival Ainsworth lay as described, his head fallen forward upon a litter of papers, his right hand clenched around a pen, whose nib had scratched a furious black star upon the page. The air bore the heavy breath of spirits, but beneath it, yes, there was the same ambiguous odor I had noted at the window, and another fainter, as of metal newly filed. Holmes did not at once approach the body. He moved first to the grate, where a little ash lay in a careful cone, and to the wastebasket where a scrap of blue twine coiled upon itself like a dead worm. Then, with a deftness that always made me marvel at the contradiction between those long, bony hands and their tenderness, he lifted Mr. Ainsworth's head and, with my assistance, made such observations as a physician's training would allow. "You see, Lestrade," he murmured, "the muscular set about the jaw, the peculiar flattening of the tongue, the contraction in the fingers. Our doctor's apoplexy will not account for these. And here on the cuff, what say you to that, Watson? A trace of pitch?" "No varnish," I said, sniffing. "Shellac." "Near enough for government work," said Holmes, with a flicker of amusement. He straightened, and his eyes flicked once more to the window between the rooms. A face at the glass at dawn. A man dead behind a locked door, a smear where a hand should not be, and cleanliness where dust should reign. "Inspector, I think your ghost is mortal, which is a pity for the newspapers and a relief for the rest of us." He turned, and in that instant there came from the corridor a sound, a stifled gasp, quickly smothered. Holmes was at the threshold in 2 strides. The passage was empty save for a draught that carried very faintly the scent we had already met twice that morning. Holmes looked back at us over his shoulder, his eyes alight. "We shall have our hands full, gentlemen," said he. "And if we are fortunate, we shall have them full before the sun has wholly cleared the garden. Come, let us begin at the beginning, which in a house is always below stairs." Holmes descended with that long, noiseless stride of his that always made me think of a stork picking its way among reeds. The warmth of the overfueled drawing-room gave way to the cooler currents of the service passage. There was a scent here of damp stone soap and yesterday's onion. A stout woman in a black alpaca gown confronted us at the turn, her respectable figure held together as much by will as by whalebone. She dropped a bob that was almost a curtsy and wrung her hands without permitting them to appear to ring. "Mrs. Greeley, housekeeper," Lestrade announced. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Her eyes, small and shrewd as currants in sweat, took us in. "If you please, sirs, the young mistress begs that we do not upset the children." "There are children?" said Holmes. "2 little ones, a boy and a girl. They sleep in the nursery next to—" She stopped as if the word itself might wake the dead. Annie, the housemaid, drew the blind. "She is in the scullery, if you must. She is scarce fit to speak." "We shall not press where silence is more instructive," Holmes returned, with an odd gentleness. "But an eyelash will sometimes tell the truth when the tongue cannot." "If you will permit me a tour of your domain." He did not wait for permission. The scullery lay beyond, its slate sinks smeared white where lye had bitten them. Tin pans ranked like shields along the wall. A thin, freckled girl with swollen lids stood by a pail. She clutched a damp cloth as if it were a talisman, and I saw the right thumb bound with a rag dusted yellow. "Iodoform," murmured Holmes, with a glance that took in thumb, pail, and the dark splash upon the floor. He lifted from the dresser a bottle, held it to his nose, and set it down again. "Carbolic. You have been brave, Annie. Tell us only what you saw." Her words came in a rush, tripping over themselves. "It were early, sir. The lamps was out and there was a queer light. Not day and not night. I drew the blind to shake the frost from the pane, for Mrs. Greeley says it spots the lace if you leave it. And there it was, as big as life, a face, white as a turnip, and the eyes like pits. It was pressed again the glass, sir." I screamed, and when I looked again it was gone. "Pressed how?" Holmes's tone was as soft as if he questioned a sleepwalker. "Flat, sir, as if a dead man had been laid outside. There was breath, there was—" She put a hand to her own mouth in a gesture that made me shiver, as if to push back a breath that was not her own. "Firmist, and a hand there too, along of it." Holmes inclined his head. "And below the window, did you run to look?" "I did not stir from the spot, sir, not if the house had burned to the ground." Mrs. Greeley made a motion of approval that had in it the whole gospel of domestic order. Holmes stepped past them to the outer door. The yard opened into a winter garden, a rectangle of ironed grass, a kitchen plot rimed like sugared pastry, a gravel path running stiff as a rule to the stable arch. The air cut at one's teeth. He stood on the doorstep with his hands in his pockets and his face lifted. "Third story," he said, half to himself. "The east wall carries no ivy, and the brick is recent and tight. A ladder." He turned and his eye fell upon the stable boy, a square lad with ears like handles, who lingered guiltily in the arch. "You, my boy, name?" "Willie, sir." "Willie, how many ladders have you at Fern Lodge?" "One long for the cherries, sir, and a painter's step-ladder what Mr. Pike—" He stopped, casting a glance of terror toward the housekeeper. "What Mr. Pike borrowed," Holmes supplied, as if to spare the boy the sin of completing the sentence. "And did he return it?" Mrs. Greeley stiffened. "Thomas Pike is no longer in this house, so I understand." Holmes was already walking, and we followed. He paced off the distance from the stable to the east wall, and from the wall to the flower bed beneath the nursery. The gravel lay as neat as a church-going conscience. The frost upon the bed was a perfect brittle crust, unstarred by so much as the brush of a bird's wing. "What say you, Lestrade?" said Holmes Lestrade, who had his collar up and his scepticism buttoned within it, looked relieved to find something solid. "No man went up that wall last night. No man in boots," Holmes agreed. His gaze dropped to the brickwork. He ran a finger lightly along the stretcher course below the nursery. The skin squeaked upon the ice. He stooped at the left-hand corner, where the sash met the stone band. I saw his nail-pick very gently, at the merest pimple of substance, another of those minute beads of tacky matter he had shown me above. "Resin," I ventured. "I fear so." "And there is upon the lower ashlar the faintest dusting. Watson, your lens," I handed it. Through the circle of glass, the innocuous brick took on character. Upon its face a faint blue bloom lay, as if a butterfly had rested there and flown. Holmes touched the stain and then rubbed forefinger against thumb. "Prussian blue," he said. "A draftsman's friend. And here—" He straightened, his eyes climbing, not the height of the wall now, but the invisible geometry of the air. "A line was cast last evening, Inspector, cast true and snapped clean. You know the builder's trick. A cord rubbed with blue is stretched and twanged to mark a straight course upon rough material. But there is another employment, when one wishes to transmit motion along a line with the least weight." Lestrade sniffed. "Do you mean to hang a man on a thread?" "Not to hang him," said Holmes, "but to irritate an obstinate piece of iron from a distance." He turned back into the house so suddenly that the stable boy nearly fell over his own feet in his haste to avoid him. Before the nursery again, Holmes examined the sash as a watchmaker reads a watch. He ran his nail along the meeting rail, and then the side groove. "Clean, cleaner than a child's conscience," he murmured. "And yet here on the bottom bead, yes, there is grit where grit ought not to be in a room where Mrs. Greeley rules." He opened his mouth, closed it, and crossed into the workroom where the engineer had died. There his movements grew more rapid. Though never careless, he knelt by the grate, picked one shining granule from the formed cone of ash and placed it upon his palm. It glinted like a fish scale. "Varnish burnt to glass," he said. "Shellac, perhaps, and He had his head in the wastebasket and emerged with that loop of blue twine I had noticed earlier, now longer by a foot where he had teased a knot open. The same hue as the bloom upon the brick, the same dust upon the keyhole rim too. He lifted the key and turned it. A stiff action. "Feel, Watson. There is an unevenness. I tried it." As if something had been tied to it. Quite so. Air cord upon a key, a resin on a sash, a breath upon a window at dawn. Our ghost is industrious. He looked not at the dead man, but at the table, at a corner where the polish had been smeared to dullness. He sniffed. "Canada balsam," he said with satisfaction, "and a hint of oil of turpentine. Your husband was an engineer, madam," he called, for Mrs. Ainsworth had appeared timidly at the threshold, but he had of late been meddling with optics. "Optics," she repeated, bewildered. "Lenses, slides, glasses that show what is not in front of them," Holmes answered abstractedly. He had perhaps a taste for the fashionable lantern entertainments. "It is no crime. You will oblige me, madam, with the key to any cupboard or chest in which Mr. Ainsworth kept instruments, not immediately concerned with his railway work." She faltered. He kept a little mahogany case, Mr. Holmes, in the closet by the writing table. "I do not—" "Mrs. Greeley," Holmes said without raising his voice, "you have the household keys," the housekeeper produced, with the solemnity of a sacrament, a ring sufficiently formidable to secure a prison. Holmes tried 3 before one slipped home with a small decisive click. Within lay a collection, such as one might see upon a scientific gentleman's sideboard. A brass-mounted tube, a box of glass plates wrapped in tissue, a bottle labelled in Mr. Ainsworth's hand, balsam, and nested in cotton a thin oval of something like glass, matted at the edges with a gummy brown. Upon that oval, a ghastly pale visage glimmered, as if a face had been trapped within like a fly in amber. Mrs. Ainsworth uttered a sound and shrank back. Holmes did not lift the thing. He only contemplated it with that dry serenity of his which, to those who did not know him, might have passed for want of feeling. "Watson," he said very quietly, "make a note. A photographic transparency of a human face, cemented with balsam to a thin guard, the edge rimmed with resin to take a hold. Inspector, you perceive how a child's terror might be marshalled like troops, but the question is not why a phantom was made. It is who held the string. We will speak with the groom who saw this apparition from below and with Mr. Lionel Hartley as to the words exchanged yesterday morning." He closed the closet and returned, the key with a bow that made Mrs. Greeley blink. "And then, if you please, we shall take the air upon the roof." Holmes's proposal to ascend the roof was received by Lestrade with the half-skeptical, half-resigned expression I had seen on the inspector's face many times before, as though he already anticipated being led through some tortuous line of reasoning that would end. Nevertheless, with results he could neither dispute nor have achieved by his own methods. Mrs. Ainsworth, visibly unnerved, excused herself with a tremulous inclination of the head, leaving Mrs. Greeley to conduct us through the upper passages. We mounted narrow stairs to the garret level, where the air was sharper and filled with the draughts that play around attics and half-used corridors. The trap to the roof opened beneath Holmes's hand with surprising ease, and in a moment we were standing in the chill light of morning upon the leads. The house's chimneys rose about us like sentinels, their tops already glistening where frost yielded to the climbing sun. Holmes moved at once to the eastern edge, his gaze sweeping the grounds below with that peculiar intensity which seemed to project not only sight but thought outward, as if compelling the landscape to confess its secrets. "You will note, Watson," he said, crouching by the parapet, "that the gutter bears a residue foreign to its purpose. Do you perceive this tackiness upon the metal? Here is resin again, fresh, unweathered, and here a thin strand adhering to the edge. With his tweezers, he drew out a filament so fine it might have been horsehair. Against the light I saw that it glistened blue. Prussian blue dust ground into the twist," Holmes continued. "This is no accident of color, but the deliberate preparation of a cord rubbed and strung with pigment. Such a line could be thrown from above, drawn taut and snapped with precision. Observe the angle, direct to the nursery sash, Lestrade muttered. So you think the fellow let down his line from here, worked mischief with the window, and pulled up again without touching the ground? It's fanciful, Holmes. Fanciful only until we recall that Mr. Ainsworth was an engineer. He, more than most, would appreciate the physics of lines, weights, and pulleys. But the matter is not so simple. The face, Inspector, the face. It did not float down of its own accord. It was contrived, attached, perhaps even projected by an apparatus. Mr. Watson, consider the transparency we have already examined. I shivered slightly in the wind that crept along the roof, but my mind followed his. The ghastly visage cemented on glass, it could be fastened at the end of such a cord, lowered before the pane, and withdrawn again without trace. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. A phantom for the maid, a distraction for the household, and while their attention fixed upon superstition, a murder, or something like murder, was enacted beside it. He paced the length of the parapet, pausing to peer down over the north side, where ivy clung in a sparse riband. Then, satisfied, he folded his arms. Enough, we have the outline of method. What remains is motive, and the hand that set this pantomime in motion. We returned below, and Holmes asked at once to see the groom who had claimed to witness the apparition. The man, a broad-shouldered fellow of weathered complexion, was brought from the stable. He removed his cap and shuffled uneasily upon the carpet of the morning-room where we assembled. "Your name?" asked Holmes. "Carter, sir." "William Carter. You were abroad in the garden at daybreak?" "Yes, sir. I'd a call from the mare, a restless night she'd had with the frost setting in. I was on my way to the stable when I looked up." He broke off, swallowing. "I saw it plain, sir. A face at the nursery glass, white as linen, staring down at me. No features as I could swear to, but the eyes. Lord, the eyes." Holmes regarded him with a keen serenity. "How long did you observe it?" "Not the turn of a minute, sir. A blink like—" I shouted, thinking some thief was there. Then it was gone. "You are a sober man, Carter." "As sober as they come, sir." "Ask any." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. That is all. Inspector, we must not discount the fellow's evidence, for it corroborates the maid's. But note, Watson, how brief was the apparition, enough to implant terror, not to satisfy scrutiny. The device was never intended to bear examination. At this moment Lionel Hartley entered, his polished boots clicking faintly upon the boards. He bowed with courtesy, but his eyes flitted quickly toward Lestrade and then Holmes, as if measuring how much each man had already divined. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" His voice was smooth, cultivated, but I detected a faint tremor in its undercurrent. "Indeed. Yesterday you and Mr. Ainsworth exchanged words?" Hartley coloured slightly. "We did. A trivial matter between gentlemen. It is of no consequence now." "On the contrary," Holmes rejoined, "the smallest quarrel is magnified when one party is dead within the day." "Pray be candid." Hartley drew a breath and straightened his tie. "My cousin Beatrice's husband had promised certain moneys to support an investment of mine. When he declined at the 11th hour, I spoke sharply. That is all." Holmes's gaze was fixed upon him with disconcerting steadiness. "Investment in what?" "In a shipping venture," Hartley replied, the words too quick, as though rehearsed. Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing more. Lestrade, however, interjected, "And where were you last night, sir?" "In my chambers here. Mrs. Greeley herself will testify that she brought me hot water at 10:30, and I did not stir thereafter." The housekeeper confirmed this with a prim nod. Holmes, without comment, turned instead to the table where the engineer's drawings lay. He lifted a sheet at random, held it to the light, and then, replacing it, spoke with quiet authority. "We are not yet at the heart of this, but we draw nearer. Mr. Ainsworth meddled with optical contrivances, and last night he died with resin, shellac, and blue dust about him. He quarrelled with his wife's cousin. He dismissed a drunken gardener. He had a former partner embittered by law. 3 lines of inquiry open before us. Which shall we follow?" He looked to Lestrade with a hint of challenge. The inspector sniffed. "I'll begin with Pike, the gardener. A violent fellow known to the yard. If any man returned here by night to frighten the house and work revenge, it is he." Holmes's lips curved in a shadow of amusement. "Very good. Pursue Pike by all means. Meanwhile, Watson, we shall attend to the instruments of the dead man and the blue-stained cord. The truth lies not in a drunken grudge, but in an intellect equal to Ainsworth's own. There is a hand here, Inspector, subtle enough to conjure phantoms and to lock doors without a footstep in the frost. That hand we must discover. His eyes were bright with that singular fire which I knew so well. For me the case had already deepened into a labyrinth, but for Holmes it had become unmistakably a game of the keenest interest. Holmes bent over the late engineer's table once more, his long fingers arranging the drawings and instruments into neat order, though his eyes seemed fixed beyond them, as if the pattern he sought lay not upon the paper but suspended in the air. I knew that look well. It meant that the case was resolving in his mind, though not yet in such a form he would permit speech. Lestrade, restless as ever when Holmes was silent, muttered about summoning men to scour Hampstead for the discharged Gardner Pike, and made for the door. Holmes stopped him with the faintest gesture. "One moment, Inspector, before you expend the Yard's energy on a wild chase. Allow me one further question of Mrs. Ainsworth." She entered almost at that instant, pale but composed, as if Holmes's summons had carried to her through the walls. Her dark dress, still creased from hurried travel, seemed to swallow her frame, but her eyes held a steady courage. "Madam," said Holmes gently, "your husband's interest in optics, was this recent?" She hesitated. "It was within the last year. He attended lectures at the Polytechnic and purchased apparatus. I thought it a harmless diversion, though it kept him late at his bench. He said it relaxed his mind from the strain of calculations." Holmes inclined his head. "And this Mr. Crowther, his former partner, did he share such interests?" She pressed her lips together. "I could not say. I have not seen Mr. Crowther in years. He bore Percival a grudge, certainly, but whether his pursuits touched on science I do not know." "Quite so," murmured Holmes, though I perceived he was weighing her words with the utmost care. "You have been most helpful." When she withdrew, he turned briskly to us. "Watson, observe. An engineer of railways entangled in optical contrivances, quarrelling with associates old and new. His death is staged as apoplexy, yet it bears the marks of interference, resin, varnish, sweet odor, and a locked door. The apparition at the window serves as smokescreen, both literal and figurative." Lestrade made a snort of impatience. "And what of the cousin, Hartley? You cannot ignore that he had words, nor that he profits if money is released." "Indeed, Inspector, he profits in theory, but his manner of life betrays a dilettante, not a constructor of ghostly illusions. No, our culprit must be both ingenious and practical, with knowledge of chemical varnishes, resins, and line. He must be someone who once shared Mr. Ainsworth's world." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It is Crowther who interests me most." We left the workroom and passed down into the hall, where a shaft of cold sunlight pierced the glass above the door. Holmes paused suddenly, stooping to pick from the carpet a tiny speck of hardened substance. He touched it to his tongue, frowned, and pocketed it. "Another trace of resin, Watson," he whispered. "But here, far from the workshop, why? Unless—" He stopped, eyes narrowing. "Come, I should like to inspect the lock of the front door." The housekeeper fetched the key ring once more. Holmes examined the heavy brass lock with lens and nail. "There, you see, particles within the wards, resin introduced upon a wire, stiffened to manipulate the bolt from without. We must not suppose the house impregnable. Someone entered and left with preparation. We followed him outside. The frost was softening in the rising sun, but enough remained to preserve impressions. Holmes prowled along the gravel, then out upon the road where wheels had scored the surface. He crouched by one print, measuring it against his hand. A cab halted here in the small hours. The horse stood long enough to pour the frost into this hollow. Note the tread of the wheel, it is nicked upon the rim. I have seen such a cab before, Watson, standing for hire near Euston Square." He rose, dusting his knees. "Lestrade, we must trace that cab. The driver may recall his fare." It was arranged that the inspector would dispatch a constable to the cab stand. Meanwhile, Holmes insisted we accompany him back within, for he had not yet done with the instruments. In the workroom he opened the mahogany case again, and laid out each piece with delicate exactitude. The brass tube, when adjusted, revealed itself a magic lantern projector of modest power. The slides, though wrapped, bore faint outlines of faces when held to light. One, unwrapped, showed unmistakably the visage we had glimpsed in the nursery transparency. A ghastly, pallid countenance with eyes hollowed by shadow. Holmes set the slide within the projector, kindled a lamp, and in a moment threw the dreadful face upon the wall. Even knowing its origin, I confess a chill ran down my spine. You perceive, Watson, how from a short distance or against a misted pane, this image would terrify the unprepared. Mr. Ainsworth dabbled in such amusements, but who last night turned his harmless contrivance to sinister purpose? At that moment, Lionel Hartley reappeared, his countenance composed but his voice edged with reproach. "Is it necessary, Mr. Holmes, to frighten the household further with these ghastly exhibitions? My cousin is scarcely cold in death, and yet his belongings are displayed like a showman's tricks." Holmes regarded him without warmth. "Truth is sometimes a ghastly exhibitor, sir. Do you deny knowledge of these instruments?" Hartley spread his hands. "I had never seen them until this morning. Percival spoke little to me of his hobbies." Holmes made no reply, but when Hartley withdrew again, he said to me in a low tone, "Mark how he distances himself too quickly. He fears implication, yet protests ignorance over much. Still, I believe his guilt is not of the hand that contrived the phantoms." A knock interrupted us. A constable had returned with tidings. A cabman at Euston remembered conveying a gentleman to Hampstead near midnight. He described him as middle-aged, of stout build, with a muffler drawn high and a travelling bag upon his knee. The cab had waited some minutes at Fern Lodge before returning. "Crowther," Holmes said softly as though to himself. "Yes, Crowther." Lestrade straightened with eagerness. "Then by thunder we have him." "I shall issue a warrant." Holmes lifted a hand. "Patience, Inspector. Circumstance alone will not do. We must lay a trap more subtle, for this man is not a common ruffian, but a mind to equal Ainsworth's own. Give him rope and he will tangle himself." He turned to me, his eyes alight with that fierce exhilaration I had learned to dread as much as admire. "Watson, tonight we shall keep vigil at Fern Lodge. Our adversary is not yet finished. If he came once to conjure faces at dawn, he will return to perfect his design. And when he does, he snapped the lantern shut with finality. We shall be waiting." Holmes's declaration that we would maintain a vigil seemed to electrify the air of Fern Lodge. Lestrade muttered something about the inconvenience of night-watching, though I knew the inspector too well to think he would abandon the field when Holmes scented his quarry. Mrs. Ainsworth, when told, looked at Holmes with a mixture of gratitude and dread, as though the promise of discovery carried in its train some new horror. The household settled into a strained quiet as dusk drew on. Fires were lit in the lower rooms, yet a chill seemed to linger in the passages despite their glow. Holmes occupied himself by studying the dead man's papers with an intensity so absolute that I doubted whether he was conscious of the tea that Mrs. Greeley brought. I watched the firelight play over his gaunt features and knew that beneath the silence his brain was whirring with those calculations and comparisons that often ended in some sudden blaze of triumph as the last colours drained from the sky and the lamps were lit along the road. Holmes rose at last and beckoned me to the stair. "Watson," said he in a voice low but vibrant, "I have considered every strand of this web. There is design here, but the hand that wove it cannot resist weaving again. Tonight we shall place ourselves so as to observe without being observed. Bring your revolver, though I hope it may not be needed." Lestrade joined us, his boots creaking upon the landing. "And what part am I to play in this little drama, Mr. Holmes?" he asked with his customary dryness. "You, Inspector, will remain with Mrs. Ainsworth and the servants, keeping them to their rooms. We must reduce the variables. Watson and I will conceal ourselves near the nursery and watch for any repetition of last night's spectacle." He led me to a small closet that opened upon the corridor, directly opposite the nursery. Its door was fitted with a narrow grating for ventilation. From this vantage, we could command a partial view of the landing, and through a crack the dark square of the nursery window. The air inside was musty with disuse, and our breath steamed faintly in the close space. Holmes settled himself like a bird of prey upon a branch, his long arms folded and his gaze fixed. The hours dragged. From below came the occasional creak of the old house, the muffled voices of servants, and once the restless cry of a child, swiftly hushed. Midnight tolled from a distant church, and with it the hush deepened. My eyelids grew heavy, but Holmes never stirred, save to incline his head once toward the window. I followed his gaze and started. Against the faint glow of moonlight, the nursery pane seemed to shiver, as though mist had formed upon it from without. A shape resolved itself, ghastly, pallid, a face suspended in the night. Its features were blurred, yet the hollow sockets where eyes should have been struck the heart with chill. For an instant I believed some apparition had truly materialized. Then Holmes's hand closed like iron upon my wrist, anchoring me to sanity. "There," he whispered, "the trick resumes." The phantom swayed slightly, then pressed closer until the faintest smear of breath clouded the glass. I heard a gasp from the corridor. The housemaid Annie, perhaps, creeping from her room despite orders, but Holmes silenced any sound by tightening his grip. With deliberate care, he pushed the closet door open and slid into the landing's shadow. I followed, revolver in hand, my pulse hammering. Holmes dropped to one knee by the skirting and ran his fingers along the join. In the moonlight I saw what he sought. A fine line, taut and trembling, stretched from the window to vanish upward. With a swift motion, he plucked it between finger and thumb and produced a small blade. The line snapped with the faintest whisper, and instantly the face at the window jerked, swung sideways, and disappeared into the night. A sound followed, an exclamation stifled in the throat, and then the unmistakable scrape of hurried feet upon the roof above. Holmes darted toward the attic stair, and I after him. We climbed like men pursued, the boards creaking under our weight until we burst into the cold draught of the garret. The trap to the roof was stirring. Someone had thrust it open and was dragging himself through. "Stop there!" I cried, leveling my revolver. But Holmes was swifter. With a bound he seized the intruder's boot, and the man toppled back into the garret with a cry. He was stout, middle-aged, muffled in a heavy coat, and his face, when it turned toward us, was familiar from description. Julian Crowther. He struggled fiercely, but Holmes had the strength of wire and sinew, and in moments the fellow lay bound with his own cord. His eyes glared with mingled fury and fear. "So, Mr. Crowther," said Holmes coolly, "you return to your old partner's house to complete your pantomime. You thought to terrify the household with a phantom while you sought something more substantial. Perhaps the plans upon his desk, or the notes in his private book." Crowther spat upon the floor. "You've no proof. A man may walk the roof of a house if he pleases." Holmes smiled thinly. "When he carries a lantern slide, a vial of resin, and a cord dusted with Prussian blue, the yard will call it more than a stroll." Lestrade burst in at that moment, having been summoned by Annie's frightened cries. His face lit with professional satisfaction when he saw the captive. "By thunder, Holmes, you've netted him." "So it was Crowther all along." Holmes raised a hand. "Gently, Inspector. We have caught him in the act, true, but the greater question remains, what was his act meant to conceal? Ainsworth is dead, not merely frightened. Crowther's trickery explains the phantom, but not the fatal seizure. That is the heart of our inquiry." He bent over the bound man, his voice hardening. "You may choose to speak now or wait until evidence mounts against you. Either way, we shall know what passed between you and your former partner last night. Did you meet him in his workroom? Did you tamper with his drafts? Or was your quarrel about more than business?" Crowther's lips compressed and he turned his face aside. Holmes straightened, his eyes burning with that inward fire I had seen at so many turning points. "Watson," he said, "we have secured the mischief-maker, but not yet the murderer. Crowther has given us half the tale. Tomorrow we shall compel the other half by examining what Mr. Ainsworth left behind, not merely in his instruments, but in his very flesh. A post-mortem will tell us what his silent lips cannot. Until then, keep your revolver close, for though our phantom is caught, the true shadow yet lingers over Fern Lodge." The morning after Crowther's capture dawned with a weak sun, filtering through the mists of Hampstead. The house stood in a peculiar hush, as though every beam and joist were listening for what would come of the events of the night. Mrs. Ainsworth kept to her chamber, sending word by Mrs. Greeley that she could not face another interview until she had gathered her strength. Lestrade, however, was jubilant, and could not be restrained from pacing the hall like a sentry, waiting to march his prisoner to the yard. Holmes, however, detained him. "You may remove Mr. Crowther presently, Inspector, but not before we satisfy ourselves that the cause of Ainsworth's death lies deeper than a quarrel and a phantasmagoria. The post-mortem must precede all conclusions." "Always delaying the obvious, Holmes," Lestrade muttered. "We catch the man upon the roof with his devil's toys and a cord in his pocket, and still you ask for further proof. A jury would need no more." Holmes regarded him with a thin smile. "A jury is one thing, truth another. Crowther may be guilty of conspiracy, but to ascribe to him a murder by apoplexy is to confuse the shadow with the object. Watson, We shall attend the examination ourselves." Arrangements were swiftly made, and within 2 hours I stood beside Holmes in the chilly mortuary chamber at Hampstead Hospital. The surgeon in charge, a brisk man named Dr. Galbraith, admitted us with the air of one who indulges an eccentric at no great inconvenience. "Apoplexy?" he asked, glancing at the papers on his desk. That was the family physician's opinion. I admit the appearance of the face was unusual, but such things vary. "Indulge me with particular care, doctor," Holmes replied. "I seek not what is usual, but what is singular." The body of Percival Ainsworth lay upon the table, pale and rigid. I steeled myself, for though accustomed to such scenes in my military practice, there was a peculiar sadness in seeing this domestic tragedy laid bare under the clinical lamp. Galbraith began his work methodically, noting the clenched jaw, the arched back, the contracted hands. I leaned closer, my physician's eye recalling the symptoms I had seen before. "Convulsions," I murmured to Holmes. "Not apoplexy, poison." "Precisely," Holmes whispered back. Galbraith looked up. "You are correct. The rigidity of the muscles, the risus sardonicus about the mouth, the lividity, all indicate strychnine. The stomach contents confirm it. There is no doubt the man was poisoned." Lestrade, who had followed reluctantly, gave a start. "Poison, is it? Then Crowther's trickery was but a sideshow." "More than a sideshow," Holmes corrected. "It was the curtain raised to conceal the true drama. While the household's attention was diverted by a phantom at the nursery window, Ainsworth sat in his workroom, dying by inches of strychnine." "But who administered it?" I asked. "Would he not have tasted the bitterness?" "Not if it were disguised," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "Remember the smell in the chamber, the spirits, the varnish, the sweetish odor. A draught prepared with care might mask the poison until too late. Crowther's presence on the roof is indisputable, but whether he brought the draught himself, or whether another placed it at Ainsworth's elbow, remains to be proved." We returned to Fern Lodge with this grim knowledge weighing upon us. Holmes went directly to the workroom once more, where the papers lay undisturbed. He examined the glasses upon the table, lifting one to his nose. "Smell, Watson. Do you detect it?" I inhaled and caught again that faint, sickly sweetness. Yes, this glass held the fatal draught. Holmes set it down with care. "Note, however, that the residue is slight. The greater part was consumed. Ainsworth believed he was drinking a cordial of his own making, perhaps mixed with spirits for the night's labor. Someone had prepared it for him, or tampered with his own bottle. We must ask who had access." At that moment Lionel Hartley entered, pale from a night of agitation. He started to see us bending over the table. "Still probing, Mr. Holmes. Surely the arrest of Crowther ends this dreadful affair." "On the contrary," Holmes replied coldly, "it begins it. Crowther's contrivances explain the phantoms, but not the poison. Tell me, Mr. Hartley, did you enter this room last night after your cousin had retired here?" Hartley flushed. "No, sir. I kept to my chamber, as Mrs. Greeley can attest." Holmes's gaze was like a blade. "And yet someone did. The key was found in the lock within, but the front door shows signs of tampering. If Crowther entered by stealth, he may have gained this chamber as well. But one detail troubles me. The poison chosen was strychnine, a substance requiring knowledge, not impulse. Crowther is an embittered partner, yes, but is he a chemist?" Hartley faltered. I cannot say." Holmes turned away abruptly. "Watson, we must revisit Crowther's history. Let us not forget that in such partnerships, one man provides capital, the other skill. Crowther may yet possess the knowledge, or he may not. Until we know which, the net cannot be drawn." Lestrade, impatient as ever, insisted on removing Crowther to the yard, and Holmes did not oppose him. Yet I could see my friend's mind was far from content. He prowled the corridors of Fern Lodge that evening, like a hound restless at the scent but not yet in sight of its quarry. At supper, which Mrs. Greeley pressed upon us in spite of the household's mourning, Holmes scarcely touched his food. His gaze drifted often to the door, as though expecting some intrusion. When at last we retired once more to the drawing-room, he spoke in a low voice that trembled with suppressed energy. "Watson, the case pivots on access. Who could reach Ainsworth's glass, and who could manipulate the scene to suggest supernatural interference? Crowther has the motive of revenge, and we have him in the act of spectral trickery. Yet the poison. The poison bears another hand. Think of the transparency cemented with balsam, The resin smeared on the sash, the neatness of the preparations. Crowther may have revived the idea, but was it originally his? He broke off, staring into the fire, his profile cut sharp against the glow. For several minutes he remained so, then suddenly sprang to his feet. "Enough, Watson. Tomorrow we call upon Mr. Crowther at the yard. I would hear his tale before the magistrate hears it. Until then, guard your sleep, for the next turn of this business will not leave us idle. I confess I lay long awake that night, listening to the creaks of the house and the sighing of the wind in the chimneys. Somewhere in its silent heart lurked the answer to Percival Ainsworth's death, and I knew that Holmes would tear it from the shadows if it cost him every hour of rest. The following morning was one of bleak skies and dripping eaves, the kind of London day that seems to dampen not only the cobbles, but also the spirits of all who tread them. Yet Holmes was brisk, even animated, as we took a hansom to Scotland Yard. His eyes had that sharp brilliance which betrayed sleeplessness, though the rest of him appeared as taut and ready as a drawn bow. At the yard, we were conducted down a corridor smelling faintly of ink, damp wool and tobacco smoke. Lestrade awaited us outside the holding rooms, his expression that of a man both satisfied and anxious, for he clearly wished Holmes to endorse the arrest of Crowther as final. "You'll find him sullen," Lestrade warned as we entered. "Hasn't opened his mouth since last night except to curse. But I dare say he'll find his tongue when he sees you, Holmes." Crowther sat upon a bench, wrists manacled, his heavy coat removed. His stout figure had lost its air of bluster. He looked shrunken, though the eyes that glared from beneath his brows were still hard and resentful. Holmes seated himself opposite him, folding his long legs with an ease that contrasted with the prisoner's awkward bulk. "Mr. Crowther," he began in that disarmingly quiet voice of his, "you must see that silence will not serve you. The evidence of your trespass is complete. The cord, the lantern slide, the resin. You have no hope of denying it," Crowther sneered. "Then why bother questioning me?" "Because, sir, the law may content itself with half a truth, but I do not. You contrived phantoms, yes, but I do not believe you poisoned Percival Ainsworth. That required subtler knowledge and access beyond your means. If you do not speak, the hangman may yet call for you on a charge greater than burglary. If you do, perhaps you may escape the noose. The choice is yours." For a moment, Crowther's defiance wavered. His gaze flicked to me, then back to Holmes. "What is it you want?" "Your account, without omission, of your dealings with Ainsworth these past weeks," Holmes said. The man drew a long breath. "I hated him, that's true enough. He ruined me in Chancery, left me near penniless. He cut me out of contracts that were half mine. So yes, I went to his house. I meant to frighten him, to repay him for the nights he left me staring at bare walls while he grew fat on profit. I knew of his dabbling with lanterns and slides. We'd once talked of exhibiting such tricks to investors. I stole one of his transparencies, rigged a line, and showed his servants a ghost. But kill him? No, I never touched his glass, never set foot in that workshop. I swear it." Holmes's eyes never left the man's face. "And yet you came armed with resin and cord, prepared to manipulate locks. If you had gained entry—" "I never did." Crowther burst out. The door was shut, the windows latched. "I meant only to unsettle the household, make them believe the place haunted. I wanted him afraid, not dead, and when I crept upon the roof I saw no light in his room. If he died, it was by another's hand, not mine." There was a ring of truth in his tone, and I saw Holmes lean back, his long fingers steepled. "You may not have killed him," he said softly, "but you have shown us that another must have done so. Tell me, who else knew of these contrivances?" Crowther hesitated, then muttered, "Hardly." He was curious. Asked me once about the slides. He fancied himself clever, but he had no stomach for the work. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Thank you, Mr. Crowther. You have told me enough." Outside the room, Lestrade grumbled. "The man admits to the phantoms, and still you hunt for shadows. Hartley now? He is but a gentleman lodger." "Gentleman or not," Holmes said sharply, "he alone had access at the crucial hour. Remember, Crowther entered by stealth from without, but someone within placed the poisoned draught before Ainsworth. Hartley quarrelled with him. Hartley had free movement about the house, and Hartley knew, through Crowther or otherwise, of the lantern tricks. The two threads may have twined together. We returned to Baker Street by afternoon, Holmes refusing to leave matters to Lestrade alone. There he spread the notes and scraps taken from Ainsworth's workroom across the table. I watched as his keen gaze flicked from one to another, then at last fixed upon a small notebook bound in worn calf. He opened it, ran a finger down the page, and gave a cry of satisfaction. "Watson, look here. These are not railway calculations, but formulas, mixtures of balsam, resin, turpentine. And here, strychnose extract diluted with spirits, written in his own hand. He had been experimenting with poisons, perhaps to test preservation of slides. But see this note. Hartley requests sample. Watson, do you grasp the import? The poison was in the house not by accident, but by invitation." I stared at the page, a chill running down my spine. Then Hartley had only to slip it into his cousin's glass under cover of the night. And Crowther's phantoms provided the perfect distraction. Precisely. Holmes snapped the book shut. Crowther's hatred provided the diversion, but Hartley's ambition supplied the hand of death. A more diabolical partnership of accident and design I have rarely encountered. That evening, Holmes wrote swiftly, sending notes to Lestrade and to Mrs. Ainsworth, requesting Hartley's presence at Baker Street under the guise of discussing her late husband's affairs. He sealed the letter with a decisive press. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said, "the mask will be torn away. Hartley has walked among us in borrowed mourning, feigning grief while calculating gain. He thinks Crowther's arrest secures his safety. But when he sits in that chair across from me, the truth will weigh heavier than any disguise he has yet worn." His eyes glittered with anticipation, and I felt again that peculiar mixture of awe and unease that always overcame me when Holmes prepared to spring the final trap. The following afternoon, the sitting room at Baker Street was prepared with that curious air of theatre which Holmes could summon at will. The curtains were half drawn against the pale light, the fire glowed at just the right pitch, and every object upon the table was placed with a precision that suggested design. Among them lay Ainsworth's notebook, the mahogany case of optical instruments, and a glass half filled with water, into which Holmes had dropped a few grains of harmless quinine to imitate the bitterness of strychnine. He paced the room with restless energy until at last the bell announced our visitor. Lionel Hartley entered with a show of composure, though his pallor betrayed a sleepless night. He bowed to Holmes and to me, speaking with that smooth courtesy that had first recommended him to Mrs. Ainsworth's hospitality. Yet his eyes darted uneasily to the articles on the table. "You sent for me, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I came out of duty to my cousin, though I confess I know little of her husband's affairs." Holmes motioned him to the armchair opposite the fire. "On the contrary, sir, you know more than you admit. We are here to discuss not merely Mr. Ainsworth's business, but the circumstances of his death. A frank word from you may prevent the necessity of harsher measures." Hartley stiffened. "If this is another accusation, I must protest. The police have already arrested the man responsible." Holmes's lips curved in that thin smile which so often preceded revelation. "Ah, Crowther. Yes, he was arrested, for climbing roofs and frightening maids. But tell me, Mr. Hartley, how came strychnine into your cousin's glass?" "Crowther denies it, and his denial bears the stamp of truth. Yet the poison was there, cunningly disguised, and you, sir, were the one man within the house who could have placed it." Hartley's hands gripped the arms of the chair, but his voice remained controlled. "This is monstrous. I had no knowledge of strychnine, nor would I stoop to such villainy." Holmes opened the notebook and turned it toward him. "Do you deny this entry?" "Hartley requests sample," written in Ainsworth's own hand. "He had been experimenting with chemicals for his optical work. You asked for a portion and you used it. The lantern slides and resin may have been Crowther's mischief, but the poison was yours." The man's composure faltered. He leaned forward, staring at the page, as if to will it into falsehood. He misinterpreted. I asked only about balsam for mounting slides. If he wrote my name beside strychnose, it was his error." Holmes's voice hardened. "Error does not pour bitterness into a glass at midnight. Error does not profit by a cousin's death. Tell me, what did you hope to gain? A loan refused yesterday, inheritance tomorrow. Such calculations are the refuge of desperate men. Confess, and you may yet find mercy." Hartley's eyes flickered wildly toward me, as though seeking sympathy, but I could not disguise my abhorrence. He rose suddenly, one hand pressed to his brow. "You have no proof. Words, notebooks, suspicions, nothing more. You cannot drag a gentleman's honor through the mire on such flimsy grounds." Holmes's hand shot out, seizing the glass of quinine. He thrust it before Hartley's face. "And yet, sir, you know the taste. Last night you disguised it with spirits. Drink now if you are innocent." Hartley recoiled as though struck. His lips moved soundlessly, then closed tight. Holmes set the glass down with calm finality. "Your silence condemns you more than words. But do not mistake me. We seek justice, not melodrama. Inspector Lestrade will join us shortly, and I trust you will be more explicit in your statement when confronted with the law." The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rattle of a hansom in the street below. At last Hartley slumped back into the chair, his bravado dissolved. "Yes," he muttered hoarsely, "I put it in his glass. I thought it would look like apoplexy. I thought no one would suspect. Crowther's tricks were a gift from Providence. I had only to let suspicion fall where it wished. Percival was a tyrant to me, as he was to others. I deserved my chance." "Your chance at ruin," Holmes said coldly. "Murder never grants prosperity. It grants only the rope. You may console yourself that your accomplice of circumstance, Crowther, will be charged with lesser crimes, but your own part is black indeed." Hartley buried his face in his hands. I could scarcely look upon him. So complete was the collapse of the man who had entered with an air of injured dignity not an hour before. Holmes, however, betrayed neither triumph nor pity. He resumed his pacing, hands behind his back, as though the confession were but another piece upon his mental chessboard. At that moment, Lestrade entered, his keen eyes taking in the scene at once. "Well, well, I see you've done it again, Holmes." "The gentleman's face tells the story." Holmes inclined his head. "You will find the written confession in due time, Inspector. For the present, I believe you have sufficient grounds for arrest." Lestrade advanced, producing the necessary warrant. Hartley rose with a kind of mechanical obedience, his voice dull. "I will go. There is nothing more to say." When the door closed upon them, I turned to Holmes. "You pressed him hard, my dear fellow. But without that notebook, without Crowther's testimony, you might never have unmasked him." Holmes shrugged. "It is often so, Watson. Murderers entangle themselves with accomplices they despise, forgetting that one witness can unravel the whole." Hartley believed the phantom would suffice to cloak his crime, but he forgot that science leaves its signature upon every act. Resin, cord, strychnine all write their own testimony. My task is only to read it. I could not suppress a shudder at the recollection of the ghastly face at the window. And Crowther. He will answer for his trespass and trickery, but he did not kill. He will leave the dock alive. Whether he will prosper, I cannot say. As for Mrs. Ainsworth, she will have her peace at last, though dearly bought. Holmes sank into his chair, the firelight glinting upon his sharp profile. For a moment he was silent. Then he added with a sudden weariness, "It is the old story, Watson, greed and resentment cloaked in spectacle. A man will kill for gain, but he prefers the world to think death came by accident. It is our role to strip away illusion, though I sometimes wonder whether mankind values its illusions more dearly than the truth." He closed his eyes. The energy of the hunt at last expended, and I sat in silence, marveling once again at the strange blend of genius and melancholy that made Sherlock Holmes at once the most brilliant and the most enigmatic of men. The following day was a subdued one. The air in Baker Street seemed almost heavy after the exertions of the past nights, and Holmes himself moved with a languor that belied the quicksilver brilliance he had displayed before Hartley's confession. He sat for much of the morning in his armchair, fingers steepled, eyes closed, the blue smoke of his pipe wreathing about him like some half-formed problem refusing to be dispelled. For myself, I busied my pen with the task of arranging my notes. Yet even as I wrote, I could not help but glance at Holmes and wonder at his silence. The case seemed concluded. Hartley had confessed. Crowther's role as accomplice was plain. The poison had been identified beyond doubt, and yet something in my friend's stillness suggested incompletion, as though he felt some part of the tapestry yet unexamined. It was near midday when Lestrade arrived, rubbing his gloved hands together against the cold. His expression was one of satisfaction tempered by puzzlement. "Well, gentlemen, Hartley has put it down in writing just as you said, Holmes. Signed confession, every word of it. Crowther, too, has admitted his trespass and will face the magistrate. All neatly tied up." Holmes opened one eye. "Neatly, Inspector. You flatter the truth. Confessions are the easiest of knots. They untie themselves if not reinforced. Hartley has admitted guilt, yes, but we must confirm whether he acted alone. The draft, the glass, the preparations, all bear inquiry still. Lestrade shifted uneasily. Surely, Holmes, a written confession is enough. Holmes sat forward suddenly, the fire lighting his angular features. Enough for a court, perhaps, but not for me. I have learned long ago never to rest upon the word of a desperate man. He may tell part of the truth, hoping the rest will remain buried. No, Inspector, I must revisit Fern Lodge once more, for there is a detail gnawing at me still. Though Lestrade groaned audibly, I was not surprised. That evening we rode again to Hampstead, where the house wore its mourning more openly than before. Heavy blinds covered the windows, and the few lights that glowed within seemed weak, as though dulled by sorrow. Mrs. Ainsworth received us with quiet composure, though her eyes were ringed with grief. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I heard from Inspector Lestrade of Lionel's confession. It has broken me afresh. To think that one of my own blood—" Her voice faltered, but she steadied herself. "I thank you nevertheless for bringing light to what was shrouded." Holmes inclined his head not unkindly. "Madam, I must trespass once more upon your patience. There is a matter of detail that troubles me. You said on the morning of discovery that your husband's hand was clenched about his pen, and that a blot of ink marred the page. Yes, it was as though he had been writing and was struck down midline. Yes, precisely. Yet when I examined the page, the star-shaped blot bore no word beside it. If Hartley had poisoned him in the night, why should he sit with pen in hand at dawn? Unless—" Holmes's eyes narrowed and he turned abruptly toward the workroom. We followed him within. The air was still tainted faintly with varnish and spirits. Holmes bent over the writing desk and spread the pages once more. Then he lifted the blotter, examined the underside, and gave a low exclamation. "Here, Watson, look." The impression of words pressed through the paper. Our engineer was writing when death overtook him, and what he wrote was not idle. I held the blotter to the light. Faint but legible were the words, "Heart The remainder trailed into a scrawl. "Hartley poisoned," I whispered. "Just so," Holmes said, his voice like steel. "The dead man himself accuses. It is the final link, Watson, the proof that the draft was taken knowingly from his cousin's hand. Hartley must have brought it under pretense of reconciliation." Percival drank, suspecting nothing, but with his last strength he seized the pen to record his suspicion. His hand failed him before the word was done. Lestrade stared, open-mouthed. "By George, Holmes, you've sealed it now. No jury will doubt when the victim himself left the name." Holmes replaced the blotter gently, almost reverently. "There is no satisfaction in such discoveries, Inspector. They speak too plainly of human frailty. Still, truth must be known, and with this the matter is indeed complete." Mrs. Ainsworth, who had lingered at the door, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "Then my husband did not die in vain," she murmured. "He spoke even as he left me." Holmes turned to her, his voice softened. "He spoke, madam, and he has been heard. Justice will follow." We departed soon after, leaving the house to its mourning. As we rode back through the fog-bound streets, I reflected upon the strange symmetry of the case, Crowther's grotesque apparitions distracting the household, while within, a quieter but deadlier treachery unfolded. It was a pattern of deceit layered upon deceit, until only Holmes's keen eye could separate truth from illusion. Holmes himself remained silent during the journey, gazing out into the mist. Only when we reached Baker Street did he speak. "You see, Watson, how men deceive themselves as much as others. Hartley believed the ghostly trick would cover his crime, while Crowther thought his phantom would avenge his pride without blood. In the end, each served as the other's disguise, and each betrayed himself by that very device, the one by poison, the other by rope and resin. It is ever so. Falsehoods entwine until the truth, patient and persistent, forces its way through." I could only nod, struck anew by the cold clarity of his reasoning. Yet as Holmes sank once more into his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed, I wondered whether even he felt the shadow that lingered. For though the culprit was unmasked, and the law would have its due, Fern Lodge would never again be free of that dreadful memory, the face at the window at dawn, and the pen that scrawled a dying man's last truth. The days that followed passed in a curious mixture of resolution and lingering unease. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensation, carried lurid accounts of the face in the window at dawn, some describing spectral visitations, and others praising the police for swift arrests. Holmes, who never read his own praise with anything but contempt, pushed the papers aside with the back of his hand, declaring that ink is a poor solvent for error. Yet I could see even he was not entirely free of the case's shadow. His violin remained untouched in its corner, and more than once I found him staring fixedly into the fire, as though still tracing invisible lines of deduction upon the flames. Lestrade called one evening with official thanks, bringing word that Hartley was remanded for trial on a full charge of murder. Crowther, by contrast, would face a lesser charge of burglary and malicious mischief, his contrivances having proved grotesque but not deadly. The inspector was jubilant, confident the Crown's case would hold. With the confession, the poison, and the dead man's blotter, it's as tight as a sailor's knot, he declared. Holmes, however, only raised his brows. Do not be too sure, Inspector. Knots are tied to be untied. Hartley's counsel may claim coercion, or that the blotter's marks are mere coincidence. You must remember that juries are swayed as much by theatre as by fact. I advise you to keep Crowther under close watch, for though his guilt lies elsewhere, his testimony may prove essential. A man embittered may speak truth more freely than one who courts pity. After Lestrade's departure, I ventured to ask Holmes whether he truly doubted the outcome. He leaned back, his thin face illuminated by the lamp's glow. No, Watson, the truth will prevail. But it is a lesson. Never imagine that the law is the same as justice. Our task is to uncover facts. What men do with them is another matter entirely. It was 2 mornings later when a message arrived by special delivery, carried on thick paper and sealed with a black crest. It was from Mrs. Ainsworth. She requested that Holmes visit Fern Lodge once more, as she had discovered among her late husband's effects a sealed envelope addressed in a trembling hand to "My beloved wife," to be opened only if I should not live. She dared not read it alone. Holmes agreed without hesitation, and I accompanied him. The house was quieter now, the blinds half drawn, and the servants moving about with the subdued tread of those who inhabit a house of mourning. Mrs. Ainsworth met us in the drawing-room, pale but resolute. She held out the envelope with fingers that shook only slightly. Holmes received it with a bow, examined the seal, and then handed it to her. "Madam, it is yours to open. We shall bear witness if you wish." She broke the seal and unfolded the sheet within. Her lips moved as she read. Then she pressed a hand to her breast and handed the paper to me. I read aloud in a steady voice, though the words themselves trembled. "My dearest Beatrice, if you should ever open this, know that I felt danger close upon me. Lionel has pressed me for money beyond what I can give. He grows desperate. Tonight I take a glass prepared by his hand, though I suspect its bitterness. If it proves fatal, remember that I loved you and that I die warning you against him. Yours, Percival." For a long moment the room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Ainsworth bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. Holmes replaced the letter gently upon the table. "It is as I feared," he said softly. "The blotter gave us fragments. The letter gives us certainty. Your husband's last thought was to shield you. This, madam, will silence even the boldest advocate." She looked up through her tears. "Then the world will know the truth. That is all I ask." Holmes inclined his head gravely. We remained only long enough to assure her that the letter would be placed securely in Lestrade's keeping, and then we departed. As we rode back through the greying streets, I could not help but marvel at the layers of foresight that had preserved the truth. The blotter's impression, the dying man's last effort with his pen, and the letter entrusted to his wife. It was as though Percival Ainsworth had fought even in death to unmask his betrayer. Holmes seemed lost in his own reflections, speaking only once, and then with that mixture of brilliance and melancholy I had come to know so well. "Watson, men labor their whole lives to build machines, bridges, and railways, yet it is in their frailties that they leave their most indelible marks." Ainsworth, with all his calculations, could not guard himself against the treachery of his own blood. And yet, with his last strength, he left a line of ink that outlived him and condemned his murderer. Strange, is it not, that the most delicate thread can bind more surely than the stoutest rope? In the weeks that followed, the case passed into the machinery of the courts. Hartley stood trial, his smoothness gone, his features worn by confinement and fear. Crowther gave testimony, grudging but damning, recounting how Hartley had pried into Ainsworth's experiments and demanded samples under the guise of curiosity. The letter, read aloud in court, silenced even the boldest defense. The jury returned their verdict without hesitation, and justice, at least as the law defines it, was done. When I remarked one evening that the case had ended more completely than most, Holmes gave a dry laugh. Completely? No, Watson. A man is dead, a woman bereaved, 2 others ruined. That is not completion. It is consequence. What we call resolution is but the point at which our interference ceases. Life goes on for those who remain, and not always more happily. He turned back to his chemical retorts, yet I saw in his eyes that distant fire, the unquenchable hunger for problems yet unsolved. For all his cold words, I knew the case had touched him. Perhaps it was the image of the dying man's unfinished scrawl, perhaps the memory of that ghastly phantom at the window, or perhaps only the melancholy knowledge that truth, once revealed, rarely brings comfort. Thus ended the affair of the face in the window at dawn, a case that to my mind exemplified both the ingenuity of crime and the inexorable power of deduction. If ever proof were needed that no mask of illusion, however cleverly contrived, can long withstand the gaze of Sherlock Holmes, this was it. And yet, as I set down the last of my notes, I found myself shuddering still at the recollection of that pale apparition pressed against the nursery glass, and at the thought of a dying hand scratching one final, unfinished word in the silence of a locked room. The conclusion of the matter came some weeks later, when spring began to touch London with the faintest warmth, and the memory of the cold Hampstead mornings seemed distant. Holmes and I sat together at Baker Street, he with his violin across his knees, I with my notes compiled, when I asked him at last whether the case of the face in the window at dawn satisfied him as one of his more complete victories. He drew the bow across the strings, producing a low contemplative chord before replying, "Victories, Watson, are for soldiers. For me, there are only problems stated and problems resolved. This one was curious, and in its curiosity instructive, but I take no pride in the downfall of Hartley, nor in the exposure of Crowther's pitiful devices. If anything, I pity them both. One sought revenge through childish theatre, the other sought gain through murder, and between them they contrived a pantomime so grotesque that it might have deceived many a sensible man. Yet all the while the truth lay in the ink upon a page and the chemistry of a draught. I reminded him that justice had been served, that Mrs. Ainsworth was free of deceit, and that Crowther, though disgraced, had been spared the worst. Surely that was worth some satisfaction. Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes distant. Satisfaction, yes, but also reflection. You see, Watson, the human imagination is both ally and enemy. It gave Crowther the means to terrify, Hartley the nerve to conceal, and poor Ainsworth the foresight to warn. Imagination may devise ghosts, but it may also leave behind the simplest, most damning mark, a name half-written, a blot pressed through a sheet. Illusion is but a curtain. Truth, though faint, shines through it if one looks steadily. He played a brighter phrase upon the violin, as though to dispel the heaviness of his words. Remember that, my dear fellow, when you set your pen to record this affair. Let the world marvel at the phantom in the nursery window if it must, but ensure it also understands the greater lesson, that crime, however cloaked in superstition, is wrought by human hands, and can be unmasked by human reason. And so it was that I set down the record of the case of the face in the window at dawn. To the public, it became another tale of Holmes's uncanny insight and the exposure of villainy. To me it was more a reminder of the fragility of trust, the tenacity of truth, and the strange theatre of crime where shadow and substance entwine. And above all, it was another chapter in the extraordinary chronicle of the man who was and remains the most singular and brilliant companion of my life, Sherlock Holmes.